So a while back, I ran into this shaggy-looking dog while I was on an island trip. If you play on the English version of Animal Crossing New Horizons, you probably know him as Shep. However, this time around, I decided to play on the Japanese version of the game, so the name he told me wasn't Shep, it was Bob. Now, when I first found this out, I thought probably like a lot of you are thinking right now, Bob? Isn't there already a Bob? And yes, to those who play on the English release of the Animal Crossing games, when we hear Bob, we think of Bob the Purple Cat. So it just happens that two completely different villagers share the exact same name, but different regions of the world. After I found that out, I thought maybe there are other villages that share the same name. And with a little research, I discovered that across the English and Japanese versions of Animal Crossing, there are in fact 19 pairs or 38 total villagers who share a name with another villager, but in the other region. I found that pretty interesting, and I thought it would be a cool idea to make a video taking a look at these villagers, and here we are. So without any further ado, let's get into it. First up, we have Biscuit and Robin. Now, what I find particularly interesting about this pair of villagers is that they were both introduced in the same game, that game being the original Dobutsu no Mori. Biscuit's Japanese name is Robin, and Robin's Japanese name is Pachiku, so in this case the shared name would be Robin. As to why they decided to change Biscuit's name from Robin to Biscuit for the English release of the game, only the localization team at Nintendo knows for sure. But if I had to venture a guess, I'd say it was probably because Pachiku is not a name that would be understood by an English audience, and seeing as she's an actual Robin, they decided to give Robin the name. Next up are the two villagers I talked about in the beginning of the video, Bob and Shep. In this case, the two villagers were introduced quite a ways apart, Bob being introduced in Dobutsu no Mori, and Shep being introduced in New Leaf, so the reason as to why the names became the same is actually pretty obvious. When localizing the original Dobutsu no Mori into English, they ran into the name Nikoban, and decided again that it would not suit an English-speaking audience, so they instantly decided on the name Bob for the purple cat, most likely because of the bobcat. However, about 11 years down the road, the Japanese team decided to name a dog villager Bob as well, so they were forced to change the name to avoid overlap. I find it pretty interesting that somehow a dog and a cat, the most opposite of opposites, somehow ended up with the same name. The only thing they have in common from a character standpoint is that they're both males. But I guess with the name Bob, what else could you do? Okay, next we have Celia and Tiffany. In this case, Celia's original name being Tiffany in the Japanese. From what I can tell, this is another Bob and Shep situation. Tiffany was originally introduced in Dobutsu no Mori E+ under the name Bazure. This was, again, most likely deemed in need of change in the West, so the name Tiffany was chosen. But during localization of New Leaf, Celia came along with the Japanese name Tiffany, and they had to change it. Next up, Ken and Dobie. The shared name in this case being Ken. Same as the previous two pairs, they were released rather far apart and most likely went through name changes for that reason. However, this time, the villager with a name geared more towards Japanese audience was released later. Dobie's original name was Ken, a perfectly acceptable name for a Western audience in my opinion. In fact, they even used the name themselves later on, so why Nintendo felt they had to change Dobie's name is a mystery to me. Dobie is a pretty cool name though. So to me, this next pair is particularly interesting because one of them no longer appears in the Animal Crossing franchise, the pair in question being Chuck and Eric. Chuck the Bull was introduced in the original Dobutsu no Mori and is known as Bifuteki in the Japanese version. However, following E+, he never returned to the series. The reason he was never brought back seems to be unknown, but he does share a name with Eric the deer. Eric's Japanese name is Chuck, and even though the English Chuck no longer appeared in the Animal Crossing series at the time of Eric's introduction, they still decided to change his name. Maybe just preparing for the possibility that someday Chuck would be brought back. Fingers crossed. Okay, for this next pair, I really have no idea why they decided to change the names. Filbert and Ricky, both squirrels, both introduced in the same game. I don't get it. I can see wanting to move away from the name Kajiro, but why to a name already in use? It just doesn't make sense to me. If anyone knows the reason, please let me know so I can sleep again. But a quick side note though, Filbert's amazing. Just look at this hero. Definitely one of my personal favorite villagers. Okay, next we have Wendy and Frida. Similar to Ricky and Filbert, they are both the same species, however in this case they were not introduced in the same game, so as to why the names were changed, it's probably up to the timing again. Wendy's Japanese name is Mizore, an actual name used for girls in Japan. From what I've gathered, when you see an actual Japanese name used in Animal Crossing, typically it's changed. I don't really understand this rule, seeing as we have examples of non-English names being used for villagers like Klaus and Olaf. Names with references to Japanese culture are one thing, but changing an actual name just because it's Japanese I never really understood. Just a translator pet peeve of mine. But moving on, we have Billy and Gruff. Okay, this is another one I just don't understand. Same species again, introduced in the same game. Why? Maybe there's something I'm missing, but it just doesn't add up to me. The only thing I could possibly think of is that they wanted to give the cranky villager the name Gruff, because it sounds more like a cranky guy's name, but still kind of odd in my opinion. Next are Paula and Gwen. So Gwen's original name was Pora in the Japanese version of the game. Paula here has the double meaning of the name Paula and the word polar. This is most likely a reference to the fact that she's a penguin, and penguins live in polar climates. Now here's where it gets a little weird. Paula in the English version of the game's original name was Rachel. Why change this? I also think that Paula would have been a better name for Gwen, a penguin, and Rachel would have been a fine name for Paula. Again, just a little odd in my opinion. Next up, Frank and Keaton, another pair of villagers of the same species. There's really more of these than I remember from when I initially researched this. These two were again released rather far apart, so you can see why the overlap occurred. But looking at the Japanese names Hulk for Frank and Frank for Keaton, we again have a scenario of two perfectly good names for a Western audience. However, Hulk is a name they may have wanted to avoid because of the Marvel character the Hulk. So in this case, it is pretty understandable that they would change the names. Next, Mac and Champ. Champ was introduced first in Animal Crossing Wild World for the DS, while Mac was introduced in City Folk for the Wii. So this time we can clearly see why they ended up with the same name. But I do think it's a shame that because Champ already had the name, Mac had to have his name changed from Champ. I just feel Champ fits a dog more than a monkey, but that's just my personal opinion. Sorry to all the Champ fans out there. Next, we have Sally, Margie, Hazel, and Callie. The shared names in this case being Sally and Hazel. This is an interesting one. So Sally was originally introduced in the English version of Dobutsu no Mori under the name Hazel, which is now the name of a new squirrel villager introduced in New Leaf. The original Hazel had her name changed to Sally in Wild World because of an apparent localization error by Nintendo of America. However, the story doesn't end there. In yet another localization error on Nintendo's part, the name Sally was already in use by yet another squirrel villager who was not in Wild World but did return for New Leaf. So to avoid even further confusion, they had to change the original Sally's name as well, settling on Callie. And just to put the icing on the cake, the name Sally was already given to the elephant villager Margie in the Japanese version of Animal Crossing, first introduced in E+. What a mess. Next, and hopefully more straightforward, we have Candy and Megan. This is the first pair on the list to include a villager introduced in the newest version of Animal Crossing New Horizons. Candy the Mouse has been a villager in the Animal Crossing series since the beginning, but her original name was not Candy, it was Kanyu, changed presumably because of its relation to Japanese culture. Kanyu being a type of drop vitamin / candy for kids in Japan. Most likely because the original name has a relation to candy, they went with that for the name. However, when New Horizons came around, the name Candy was used by the Japanese team for a new bear villager, so they had to change her name and decided to go with Megan. Interestingly, in the photo you received from Megan, she can be seen holding a lollipop, a reference to her Japanese name. Next, we have Patty and Morang. Again, we have a large difference in release date here, so the overlap is understandable. Patty's original name is Codby, or rib meat in English. The name was changed for the obvious reason that we don't know what Codby means. However, the name they chose would later be used for Morang the rhinoceros in the Japanese version of New Leaf, so it had to be changed in the West. As to why Morang's name is Patty in Japanese, well, it most likely comes from the French word pâtissier, meaning pastry chef, which is also commonly used in Japanese. I think Patty makes a fine name for Morang as well, but of course due to the overlap, it had to go. Next, Monique and Jane. This is another example of two villagers released at the same time that for some reason ended up with overlapping names across regions. However, in this case, Jane no longer appears in the Animal Crossing series, being removed following Animal Crossing E+ in Japan. A little bit of a side note on Jane, she is one of the only villagers to undergo a redesign when brought over to the West. Originally she had dark brown skin and white fur, but was changed to a purple gorilla for the West. Similar to Jinx from Pokemon, this was presumably done due to the racial insensitivity of the design, which also possibly led to her removal from the game entirely. Alright, now we have Antonio and Olaf, yet another example of a pair of the same species of animal sharing a name across regions. There really are a lot of these. Now in this case, Antonio was released first in Animal Crossing E+ in Japan under the name Makoto. This is a common Japanese name, so presumably for that reason it was changed to a more familiar name in the West and a great pun, Antonio. But a few years later, the Japanese team also decided to go with the same pun for an anteater, thus the name had to be changed, eventually becoming Olaf. Coming up, we've got Pachamina and Barbara. Now, admittedly, if you were to directly translate Pachamina's Japanese name Barbara, you would use the traditional spelling of Barbara, while with Barbara's name they've gone for the sheep pun and added an extra A. So the names aren't really the same, but I decided to include them anyway because they are extremely close. Barbara came first in the series, being introduced in the original Dobutsu no Mori under the name Torawa, or the French word for three, trois. Why they decided to change a French name, used in a non-French game, to another name is unknown to me, but the pun is pretty good. But again, in New Leaf, when Pachamina was introduced, she was given the name Barbara in Japanese, and even though it isn't exactly the same, they decided to change it. What is weird, though, is that the name Pachamina comes from Persian, so why is that okay, but Trois isn't? A little bit of an inconsistency there, but I guess the games they debuted in were released pretty far apart. Moving on, we have Sky and Lily. This is another textbook case of release date difference being the culprit. However, Lily's original Japanese name is Rainy, which I believe to be a perfectly fine name for a frog. She can even be seen in her photo in New Horizons with a rainy backdrop. I just find it kind of sad when cute little details like that are lost for really no reason because of localization. That's one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this video and my YouTube channel as a whole. But without further ado, we've come to the final pair of villagers, Bianca and Whitney. Bianca means white in Italian, so they most likely share the name because they both have white fur. For the last pair, we again see our old friend release date difference rears ugly head, but in this case, both villagers were released rather recently, with Whitney being introduced in Wild World and Bianca in New Leaf. What I do find weird here is that this is a reverse situation to almost every pair up to this point. The name Bianca was rejected for Whitney before there was even any overlap, but they later decided to use the name anyway. Why Nintendo did this, I have no idea, but it was presumably up to the translators in charge at the time of the two villagers' naming's discretion. Well, that ended up a lot longer than I originally expected. We're at about 10 minutes at this point, so thanks for sticking with me through the whole thing, I guess. Thanks for listening to my voice for 10 minutes. This was my first step in making a YouTube video whatsoever, so any feedback you have for me, I'd love to hear it, good or bad. I just want to get better at making videos, and I want to make stuff that people want to watch, so anything you have, I'd love to hear it. I'll be making more stuff from now on about localization and gaming, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, stick around, I guess, and stay tuned. Back out.